All right, so are you ready to dive into some pretty mind-bending stuff today?
Always up for a challenge.
Haha, okay, good, because we're tackling the ghost in the machine.
Ah, Koestler.
Yeah, you know that YouTube summary you sent me?
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't really do it justice. I mean,
Right.
this book is seriously dense,
It's a tough one to summarize, for sure.
but it asks some really big questions.
Yeah, about like what it means to be human, right?
Exactly, and one of the things that struck me right away was how Koestler himself wasn't just, like, a philosopher.
Oh yeah, he was all over the place.
He was a biologist, psychologist, historian, like, you name it.
And it really shows in his writing.
Yeah, he brought this whole range of knowledge to the table, which makes his arguments so much more compelling.
You're not just getting abstract ideas, he backs it all up.
Exactly. It's not just like armchair philosophy.
Yeah, yeah.
So, one of the first things I wanted to dig into was his critique of behaviorism.
The poverty of psychology.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're just, more complex versions of Pavlov's dogs.
Right? Just stimulus and response. That's it.
And he uses this great example of conversation to make his point.
Oh yeah, what was it?
Well, imagine someone says, don't mention it, right?
Okay, pretty common phrase.
Totally. We say it all the time without even thinking.
Hmm.
But a behaviorist would say that our response is automatic, like, you're welcome, or no problem.
But in reality, it's way more nuanced than that.
Right. There are so many ways you could respond depending on the context.
Like who you're talking to, what kind of mood you're in even.
Oh, absolutely. You could be sarcastic, you could be playful.
Or even like philosophical.
Exactly. The possibilities are
Yeah,
endless.
it's not just a simple input-output equation.
And Koestler's point is that language is operating on this whole other level.
It's like a hierarchy, right?
Yeah, he calls it an open-ended hierarchy.
Where each word carries so much baggage.
It's like a whole history of cultural meaning, personal experience, all packed into this one little sound.
That depending on how we connect those sounds, those words,
We create this whole universe of expression.
so much deeper than just stimulus response.
And this brings us to one of his most well-known concepts.
You mean the holon?
Yeah, that's the one. And I'll admit, when I first came across it,
It does sound a little intimidating,
right, like, what is this thing?
but the idea itself is actually pretty simple.
Yeah, and incredibly powerful once you start to see it.
So how would you explain it?
Well, it's basically anything that is both a whole and a part at the same time.
Okay, so like a cell in your body.
Exactly. Each cell is a complete unit. It functions on its own.
Right, but it's also part of a larger organ.
And that organ is part of a system and ultimately part of you.
So it's like these nested levels.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And each level is both complete in itself and also a building block for something larger.
And this structure repeats itself
Yes.
everywhere, right?
Everywhere, in nature, in societies, even in our own minds.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls.
Ha ha ha. Yeah, perfect analogy.
You open one, and there's another one inside.
And another and another.
And Koestler uses this fascinating example.
Oh, I remember this one.
Yeah, the sponge, right?
Yeah, what was it again?
Well, you can take a sponge and separate it into all these individual cells.
Okay.
But the crazy thing is, those cells can reorganize themselves back into a whole sponge.
Wait, really? They just find their way back together?
It's wild.
That's incredible.
And it shows this drive in holons toward both self-assertion, like maintaining their individual identity.
Oh, okay, so like individuality.
Yeah, and also integration, cooperating as part of that larger whole.
So it's this constant tension between being a part and being a whole.
Exactly. It's a dance between those two forces.
And that tension is what gives complex systems their stability and flexibility.
Makes you look at the world a little differently, doesn't it?
It really does. And speaking of looking at things differently, another area where Koestler really challenges conventional thinking is evolution.
Oh yeah, he wasn't satisfied with just the Darwinian view.
Right, that whole survival of the fittest random mutations thing.
While those are important, he felt like they didn't fully capture the whole picture.
Like there's something more going on.
Yeah, a kind of intelligence woven into the fabric of evolution.
And he uses this great example of the panda's thumb to illustrate his point.
Ah, right, which isn't really a thumb at all.
Exactly. It's actually a modified wrist bone.
A pretty ingenious adaptation.
And his point is like, what are the odds of that happening just by pure chance?
Seems incredibly improbable.
And this is where he introduces the concept of a genetic micro-hierarchy.
Where genes are operating not in isolation, but as this complex interconnected system.
It's like evolution has its own internal selection process.
Right, and it's guiding the evolutionary path in ways that we're just beginning to understand.
It's like evolution is playing a much more active role than we traditionally give it credit for.
And he saw these patterns in how this unfolds, like his idea of drawback to leap.
Now, that one really caught my attention.
It's a fascinating concept, right?
So, explain it to me again. Drawback to leap. What is that all about?
Well, he points to the example of reptiles evolving from amphibians.
Okay. Amphibians lay their eggs in water.
Right. And reptiles evolved to lay their eggs on land.
A pretty big leap moving from water to land.
Huge. But it created a problem for the developing embryos.
Right, because they're used to that watery environment.
Exactly. So to make this leap onto land, reptile embryos actually developed a membrane within the egg.
Like a little mini pond.
Yeah, basically it mimics the aquatic environment of their amphibian ancestors.
So evolution had to kind of take a step back
Yeah, reactivate an older program.
to propel itself forward.
It's a mind-blowing idea.
It really is. And this drawback to leap pattern shows up all over the place.
Throughout the entire history of life.
It's like evolution is building on itself, repurposing what already works in new and creative ways.
Which leads us to Koestler's exploration of the human brain.
Ah, yes. The three brains.
And his very interesting and somewhat controversial ideas there.
This is where things get really personal, right?
Talking about what makes us who we are.
Exactly. And he connects our evolutionary past to our present behavior in such a profound way.
He draws on the triune brain model, which suggests our brains are made up of these three interconnected layers.
Like those Russian nesting dolls again.
I love that analogy. It fits so well.
And each layer reflects a different stage in our evolutionary history,
Right, so we're carrying around all these ancient ancestors in our heads,
influencing our thoughts and actions.
and sometimes battling for control.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are these three brains?
Well, the oldest layer, the reptilian brain, is all about survival.
So breathing, heart rate, that fight or flight response.
Exactly, the stuff that keeps us alive.
Our inner lizard brain always on the lookout for danger.
Exactly. And then we have the old mammalian brain, or the limbic system.
This is where our emotions come in.
Right, feelings like fear, love, the desire for connection.
So this is what makes us social creatures.
The part of us that needs to belong, that craves intimacy.
And then finally, the new kid on the block, the new mammalian brain, the neocortex.
This is the most recent addition, and it's what gives us all those uniquely human abilities.
Language, reasoning, abstract thought.
This is where our higher cognitive functions reside.
The part that allows us to plan for the future, contemplate the universe.
And create art and technology.
Okay, so we've got the reptilian, the old mammalian, and the new mammalian brain. 3 layers, all interconnected.
But not always in perfect harmony.
And that's where things get really interesting because Koestler goes on to say that the human brain is actually characterized by schizophysiology.
A kind of split between the old and new brains.
So our emotional and rational selves aren't always on the same page.
Often leading to some pretty serious internal conflict.
And this disconnect, he argues, is at the root of a lot of humanity's struggles.
Conflict, violence, self-destructive behavior, all of it.
But wait, he also talks about things like poetry and humor.
Right, so where do those fit into this whole picture?
That's what I was wondering. It seems like a bit of a jump.
Well, he sees those as ways of bridging the gap between these different parts of ourselves.
Okay, so like integrating the old and new brains.
Exactly. He describes poetry as a kind of regression in service of the ego.
Okay, break that down for me.
So rhythmic language, the vivid imagery, it taps into the emotional power of the old mammalian brain.
Right, so it speaks to our heart.
But it's also conveying complex ideas from the neocortex, so it speaks to our mind as well.
So it's like poetry can bridge that gap.
It can speak to both parts of ourselves at the same time.
Interesting. And what about humor?
Well, he sees humor as another way of bringing these different parts of ourselves together.
By juxtaposing incompatible ideas.
Exactly. It creates this mental dissonance that can be jarring, but also liberating.
Like shaking things up, seeing the world from a fresh perspective.
And ultimately, maybe helping to integrate those different parts of ourselves.
Okay, so we've got this tension between the old and new brains, this schizophysiology, but things like poetry and humor can help us to bridge that gap.
At least that's Koestler's take on it.
And it makes you wonder if there are other ways to bridge that gap.
Ways to overcome those self-destructive tendencies.
Because all this talk about conflict between the old and new brains, it paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does raise some serious questions about the human condition.
And that's where Koestler drops this bombshell, the idea of mental
Oh
stabilizers,
yeah, that's where things get really controversial.
like manipulating our brains to overcome our
It's,
flaws.
it's a pretty radical idea.
And it brings up all sorts of ethical questions, but that's a conversation for another time.
Definitely a lot to unpack there.
Okay, I think we need a moment to digest all of this before we dive into part two.
Agreed. My brain needs a break.
All right, we'll be back soon to explore the implications of Koestler's radical proposal and what a mentally stabilized society might actually look like.
Stay tuned.
It's a conversation you won't want to miss. Welcome back. You know, I have to say, my brain's been working overtime trying to process all this Koestler stuff.
Yeah, he really gets you thinking, doesn't he?
It's like he throws a grenade into your whole worldview.
And then just walks away.
Yeah, exactly. So last time we left off with this pretty radical proposal.
The mental stabilizers.
Yeah, tampering with human nature, the whole thing.
It definitely pushes the boundaries, that's for sure.
And to be honest, it kind of freaks me out a little bit.
I get it. It's a scary thought, messing with the very fabric of who we are.
Right. I mean, are we talking about some kind of mind control situation here?
Well, it's important to remember that Koestler wasn't a neuroscientist.
Right. He was more of a philosopher.
Exactly. So he didn't really get into the specifics of how these mental stabilizers would work.
More of a thought experiment, then.
Right. Throwing out the idea and seeing where it lands.
But he did paint this picture of a society with reduced aggression.
A world where those primal urges are kept in check.
Less violence, less conflict, more harmony.
Sounds pretty utopian, doesn't it?
It does. Almost too good to be true.
And the question is, would we be losing something in the process?
Like what?
Well, what about those qualities that drive us to achieve great things? Like ambition, passion, competition.
Would those just disappear?
Koestler didn't think so.
Really? How come?
He believed that those qualities wouldn't necessarily be suppressed. They might even be enhanced.
I'm not sure I follow.
Well, think about it. If we're less driven by fear and scarcity, if we're not constantly competing for resources and status.
We might have more energy for other things.
Exactly. Creativity, collaboration, innovation.
Interesting.
Imagine all that energy that's currently devoted to conflict and violence being redirected towards solving global challenges.
Like poverty, climate change, disease.
It's a pretty compelling vision, isn't it?
It is, but it also feels a little naive.
How so?
I mean, come on, our society's built on competition, individualism, the pursuit of material wealth.
It's hard to imagine all of that just disappearing overnight.
It would require a fundamental shift in values and beliefs.
And that's where Koestler's concept of self-transcendence comes in.
Right, the idea that we have this innate drive to connect with something larger than ourselves.
Exactly. And he believed that this drive can be channeled in many different ways.
Through art, spirituality, social activism.
It's about finding meaning and purpose beyond our own individual needs.
So instead of being driven by self-interest, we'd be more focused on the common good.
Contributing to something larger than ourselves.
I guess I can see that happening, maybe on a small scale.
But to really create lasting change, it would have to happen on a much wider scale.
Which brings us back to the whole mental stabilizers thing.
Because even if we could develop something like that,
It still feels like we're playing with fire.
absolutely, any attempt to manipulate human nature is going to have potential downsides.
Unintended consequences, things we can't even foresee.
Which is why Koestler emphasizes the importance of self-transcendence.
Not just changing our brains, but changing our hearts and minds.
It's about cultivating the wisdom and compassion to use our knowledge responsibly.
Because if we're not careful, we could end up creating a dystopia.
A world where individuality and freedom are sacrificed in the name of stability and control.
It's a slippery slope.
And we need to be having these conversations now, before it's too late.
Before we go too far down a path we can't come back from.
We need to be asking ourselves, what kind of future do we want to create?
And what are the potential costs?
It's a lot to ponder, that's for sure.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we need another break to let all this sink in.
Sounds good to me.
We'll be back soon for the final part of our deep dive into Koestler's The Ghost in the Machine. Okay, so we're back, and I gotta say, The Ghost in the Machine, it's really gotten under my skin.
Yeah, Koestler, he just throws these huge ideas at you, and then it's like, well, now what?
Exactly, like where do we even go from here?
He doesn't exactly give you a roadmap, does he?
No, he doesn't, but I think that's part of the point.
Makes you do your own thinking.
Yeah, and it feels especially relevant right now.
Like with all the crazy technological advancements happening.
It's almost like we're catching up to Koestler's vision.
Yeah, he was talking about this stuff decades ago.
And he saw both the potential and the danger.
The good and the bad.
So that brings us back to this question of mental stabilizers and like if we can actually manipulate our own evolution.
How do we do responsibly?
Right, because the stakes are pretty high.
Messing with human nature? I mean, that's some serious stuff.
And Koestler doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
No, but he pushes us to think about it, to grapple with these big questions.
And to me, it comes down to this idea of self-transcendence.
That urge to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, finding meaning and purpose beyond our own little ego bubbles.
Because if we're just focused on our own needs and desires...
We're going to end up screwing it all up.
Exactly. We need to see the bigger picture.
But the cynic in me is like, come on, is that even possible?
To transcend our own selfishness.
Yeah, I mean, look at the world. It's a mess.
I hear you. It's tough to stay optimistic sometimes.
But Koestler would probably say that human history is full of ups and downs.
It's not a straight line.
And there's always the potential for change.
It's not about being naive. It's about recognizing that we have agency.
That we can make choices that shape our destiny.
Both individually and collectively.
So where do we even begin?
Well, Koestler believed it starts with each of us.
Okay, so not waiting for some big political movement or technological fix.
Nope, it's about taking responsibility for our own evolution.
Starting right here, right now.
Making conscious choices in our daily lives.
How we treat each other, how we engage with the world.
Because even the smallest actions can have ripple effects.
The butterfly effect, right?
Exactly. Everything is interconnected.
So it's not just about mental stabilizers, it's about a much deeper shift in consciousness.
Recognizing our interconnectedness.
And acting in ways that benefit the whole.
Yeah, it's a challenging path, but also incredibly inspiring.
Because it means we have the power to create a better future.
More just, more compassionate, more sustainable.
It's a vision worth striving for, even if it seems impossible at times.
Koestler, he gives us a lot to think about, that's for sure.
He really does, and I think The Ghost in the Machine, it's a book that everyone should read.
Especially now, in these crazy times.
It's a reminder that we're not just passive passengers on this ride.
We're co-creators.
And the future is ours to shape.
So let's get to work.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Thanks for diving into this with me.
It's been a wild ride.
Until next time, keep those minds open and keep questioning.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.